Hello, everybody, and welcome back to episode almost 60. Wow, it's episode 59. I almost said 60. We have still one to go. And the Swiss AI Engineering Podcast. In today's episode, we are covering a lot of different topics. Initially, we said 5-10 minutes today, Joao, but we ended up having a stacked list. So we're discussing today Claude Sonnet 5, GPT 5.6, the release. And then also there's a new trend happening in AI that's KYC for AI, meaning a lot of the individuals, builders, and enterprise probably have to KYC. We'll quickly dig into this. And then we round it up with some current challenges, more specifically AI software factories, the new era probably of software development life cycles, or short SDLC, probably has been initiated. There is some kerfuffle around what AI builders can do for this, and especially how enterprise can then insource externally developed software to ultimately save, well, Joao, all these millions and billions of dollars. But good to have you back, Joao. I think it's like 40-ish degrees in Lisbon. Actually, this heat wave was here in Switzerland last week, and it was probably the hottest I've ever felt in this country. And now this whole stuff moved to south of Europe. So how have you been? All the ACs are probably on fire like the NVIDIA chips in the data center.
Uh, I imagine the situation is very similar, yes. And much like it is quite a bit hard to find inference providers for AI, especially ones that are compliant with your systems, it's also equally as hard to find people to do AC maintenance work because they're all also as busy. Very different industries. I'm not sure if AI could be much help here, but they're certainly in dire need of labor, I guess. I think these physical things will be the last ones to actually be automated, unless we get those Chinese robots that the Korea and Japan and China are so hard to try to build them.
Yeah,
But
we get
we're yet
them.
to see the commercialization of them.
We get them Taekwondo robots or like these. They're really impressive. Maybe we can do another episode on just robotics and AI. But for the time being, maybe today, let's quickly focus on just some of the latest model releases that have been, of course, pushed. Maybe very initially, Fable 5 was reinstated. I've been heavily testing it since it's been coming out. Probably ballpark 50% worse than when it initially came out. My usual workload, I was very happy to switch to Fable 5 initially, generate the slides, execute particular analysis, and much, much more. And it just doesn't perform that well. But they basically are improving, of course, probably after this negotiation with the US government. It's essentially, well, the routing back to 4.8, but then probably internally, there must be having some sort of a change, how much parameters are active. It just seems to be a lot worse of a model. That's my personal, I would say, user experience, and it could certainly change. What I've seen also, it's only available for a few more days. So that's also worth noting. And they put it again behind the initially planned paywall. But that's a very high level update on Fable 5. I was incredibly impressed when it came out. Now I'm mostly using Opus 4.8 on max mode for most, if not all, my more complicated tasks. I have not been fabling around. So let's quickly talk about Sonnet 5 though, GPT 5.6 as well. Where do you see this Sonnet 5 landing? Have you kind of wrapped your head around what's the use case in this new ecosystem?
I was trying to place it in the benchmark, especially not only against OpenAI's models and the existing cloud models, but also the entirety variety of models. Because Chinese like open source models are no longer this super fringe and local thing that the nerdiest people know about. They've been around, and since DeepSeek, people know that they exist, and they are sometimes very, very cost effective. And Sonnet is just not that competitive, especially in terms of pricing. You can place it in the benchmarks along the sides of sometimes previous Opus releases, the older Opus versions, some of the open source versions, but pricing wise, it's still an Anthropic model, which comes at a very premium cost to run, both on input and output. And since we've had like the latest DeepSeek models that just in terms of pricing, and they had such an optimized cache system that you could run these agentic flows, agentic loops for such a reduced price tag, that now seeing and going back to normal cloud models with their normal expensive pricing system feels always a bit hard to come back to.
I think it's just, yeah, I was thinking about this the other day as well, because I was asked by a university in Switzerland to just write some sort of an article. Where are we in agentic artificial intelligence? Where we are heading, and what are some of the current, let's say, I would say, well, challenges to figure out by AI builders. And ultimately, I think it comes down to this LLM council component as well. So you might have, as an enterprise, an LLM council. You're maybe a C-level, a senior manager, and you have an array of models that are essentially working for you or helping to achieve some sort of a decision. Should you go left in strategy or right? Should you purchase a particular software or sell or actually build it in house? An LLM council for your day-to-day management practices. And you can then ultimately kind of select which LLM would then sit in this council and guide you through your day-to-day decision making and or your operational procedures and so on and so forth. A bit of a futuristic outlook how a strategic management role could actually be looking like. And then you need to basically fill in these seats in this council, and the seat is essentially a large language model. Would I place a Sonnet 5? Probably not. So I would rather, for this heavy lifter of a lot of the work, like in the advisor and operator strategy or executor and advisor strategy, I would probably rather place an open source model with an appropriate license that I can fine tune on my context. So this probably whole fine tuning trend is again, bring it back into the picture. So I would not use a Sonnet. I would probably use, again, an open source GLM or maybe DeepSeek with the appropriate license that I can fine tune as an enterprise. Many of the tokens that I'm going to be paying to all the hyperscalers to run that stuff is probably going into this direction. So open source probably gets a hefty bulk of my workload as a strategic manager or even as an ops person at an enterprise. And then all the rest, like the super, I would say, complicated task or decision making, when all the sub tasks were actually being executed, I would probably route to a closed source model. And again, probably not a Sonnet 5. That will be probably like a Fable 6 or Fable 7. So you have the LLM council, once again, consisting of different LLMs. They have different, well, basically setups. The heavy lifting probably is done, in my opinion, more and more by open source, fine-tuned on enterprise data. And closed source is doing most of the supervision and heavy decision tasks. Do you see that similarly, or do you think this LLM council idea, initially popularized by Karpathy, is not a thing?
Mm, In most setups, I'm seeing that the biggest models have a very specific place, and because of the price tag, a very specific role, which is that supervisor or orchestrator mode, and then you have a need, and there is a real need for most workflows of a cheap, fast, and reasonably intelligent model. It does not have to be a PhD level, but it's just a model that you can reliably trust to get you some information. The retrieval information, and we talked about RAG systems and all of those things. Most cases, you cannot just do RAG, does not have whole your knowledge base in some kind of database and just query it. It most times is somewhere in SharePoint, somewhere on the web, somewhere on your Gmail or on your calendar from a year ago. And there's a need for your orchestrator to say, hey, I need to know this thing, this specific thing. Go get me the information. And you can initially know, like, oh, it's probably like in this folder, like in your local folders for this user, or it's probably like an email, like an old memo from an email. And having the supervisor do this work manually is incredibly expensive. I mean, you'd be paying $2-3 just to search for an email. Even if, no, it's hard to find, it's still maybe not cost effective and you'd rather do it yourself. But if you can have DeepSeek V4 Flash, or as Anthropic would want it, a Sonnet level model or a Haiku level model, then it's much more cost effective. However, as Sonnet is right now, and as Haiku is right now, they don't pose they're not the best models for these kinds of jobs. So they're not fast enough and they're not cheap enough compared to what it is out there. You can run, most people are running in the forums, you can check DeepSeek V4 Flash. It's like a super fast, super efficient model from DeepSeek where you can just reliably use it to get this kind of information. And your orchestrator model, like your Fable, Opus, GLM 5.2, whatever frontier model you're using, can just reliably call upon these, call them explorers or researchers, and ask them for information. and then let them go and spend their tokens much cheaper, get information for you, and you can keep going your job. And the good thing about this is, depending on your workflow, but in most cases, you can do this in parallel. So you can get one agent to get you some information, the other agent to get you some more information. And at the end, the supervisor and the orchestrator, in principle, the smartest model, can just compare the two and give you an analysis, which is probably what you wanted in the first place.
I think, I mean, just by the time that you were explaining this, I mean, then I'm just asking myself currently also is like, where do then the other models by Anthropic fit in that are not superb intelligence? So, for example, Sonnet, generally speaking, or maybe even Opus if you have a Fable 6 available, or let alone Haiku. Like if you build a multi-agent system or a large language model council, or maybe a software factory, more on that in a second today, you probably have one or two absolutely frontier, best-in-class intelligence model that's probably coming from Anthropic and from OpenAI. But all the rest, all the heavy lifting, all like the sub-task and the sub-research and the sub-executables, you will probably not give to them as well, because that doesn't make sense from a return on AI perspective. You give it entirety basically to China. So all these Chinese models are probably doing the heavy lifting, and then only the very superb intelligence is being then provisioned by closed source labs. So
However,
that gives a bit of a dual future.
I do want to pose a more realistic view on this, which is we are incredibly privileged in the way that we have access to multiple different subscriptions, multiple different inference providers within the EU and outside, and we can build on top of those. A lot of companies that I've worked on, and sometimes companies that I advise on, they are working on a single cloud provider stack. So they're working with AWS only or with Azure only. And so they rely exactly on the models that exist within those clouds. And not only within those clouds, but within the regions that they want to do the inference on. So I've seen companies that, yes, they want to use DeepSeek V4, or they want to use, Xiaomi's models, like they call it Mimo or Mimo. They're pretty good and competitive with DeepSeek. GLM from ZI. So you have these models, but they're not on your cloud provider, so you can't use them. What you can use, however, is the Sonnet level models, is the Haiku level models, because Anthropic and OpenAI, being as big as they are, being the Western companies with heavily and very deeply built commercial relationships with the cloud providers, they'll be available in your cloud stack. And they'll be available in your cloud stack a couple days after the release date, so you don't have to worry about, these big differences between the release date, and you can actually use them. Sometimes you can use them from day one. And so I imagine that, yes, it'd be much better to use cheaper models and more efficient models and just keep the market as competitive as possible. For most companies, however, they're limited to the Anthropic lineup, OpenAI lineup, or a combination of both. And in that case, Sonnet and Haiku models come into play.
Yeah. I mean, that only is given, or let's say is a bit depending on how flexible your setup is. If you can self-host it in your cloud, you have this setup which is probably reserved to only the super large enterprises, then you have a bit more flexibility. If you just ping it to whatever based on the catalog of the providers in terms of hyperscalers, then yes, you probably are stripped away by like 80 or 90% of what you could actually run if you completely manage it by yourself. So that's a little bit, I think, the kerfuffle and conundrum where all these models are coming together. I mean, now it's July 3rd, 2026. There is probably the next few weeks again an array of models being released, and this constantly changes, right? So that's also the dynamic. LLM councils needs to be continuously updated. The software factories need to know, I mean, in terms of setup, which LLMs should actually execute what particular subtask, and so on and so forth. So this whole model selection, that's why we actually cover this on the show as well, is continuously to be fully relevant, because if you take the wrong model, you just pay a hefty premium for no additional intelligence. Then before we wrap up the show, today's show, I have one or two more topics. One is KYC for AI. Do you think in the future where we have Fable 6 coming out, let's think back to the US government ban on Fable 5, that everybody that would want to use a Fable 6 level model or Mythos 6 would need to KYC, driver's license, passport. Anthropic would know who you are that is actually using this intelligence, or not yet?
They will certainly and for sure push for it. It's not that they actually need this kind of information to run the model will run fine without it. It's, I think, incredibly valuable for them to have this kind of tight control or access to the model, especially when accessing the model and connecting this model to whatever your harness is can actually give you a boost in an advantage commercially. Then you can get pick and choose which companies are getting this boost, which companies are not, and you can get a better hand on the market and basically try to control it or monopolize it, which is a very, common thing to do these days, to get some kind of monopoly over things. I think, however, that it'll be incredibly hard for them to do so at a global scale because they are not the sole providers of models. We mentioned this before, we'll keep mentioning it again and probably mentioning it again next year. There are open source makers and there are other makers that they're just selling closed source models still, but still very good frontier models that are competitive against Claude and against OpenAI. And so if you have these super closed, hard to access Claude models, you're going to go to the next best thing. If the next best thing is at a good price point, then why would you even consider going to Claude or OpenAI? And slowly and surely, they're going to start to lose clients, and they have to take into account how much harder are they willing to make things for the clients and companies that they don't want to do business with, and how much money are they willing to burn because of it, because it will cost them money over time. And this is a game that runs on incredible amounts of money, so you can't really just uh, throw a tantrum and just not take any new clients for a while. You need billions of income and a constant flow to keep your data centers running. We mentioned before, data centers are like this super heavy investment, and it doesn't last nearly as long as you think it would if you don't know about this like AI world. It lasts you, I think, 3 to 5 years on most of the hardware. After that, the GPUs, like new generations, can probably outperform them and just be so much more cost efficient that your hardware is basically legacy. So you need billions and billions and just keep on building and keep upgrading data centers. It's going to be hard for them to have this kind of control. They're going to try for it, but it's mostly going to be for PR and, politics.
A bit of fear mongering. I think I mean, as we've seen in banking, right? So initially, most of the banks in Switzerland, they didn't need to KYC or know your customer profile, anybody. They need to ask for most of the things, where they live, where they file their taxes, where they're tax liable, and all these elements that banks are required to be actually asking. It was just a little bit done under the law, under the hidden Geneva office walls and the Zurich office walls here in Switzerland. And now it's fully required by any financial institution globally to actually do KYC or know your customer. Maybe like similar things could be happening in AI. For now, you don't need to do any KYC, but maybe more and more ongoingly, when the models are more capable, some governments in the world would like to know who is actually running this model and if they're actually due diligently running it, and so on, so forth. So maybe before we wrap up the show, I want to quickly tease a bit of a new, let's say, it's not a new phenomenon, but it's certainly a new direction that the world seems to be heading based on two things. First, I've ran a quick experiment on Fable 5, Mythos 5, normalizing the following things. So now we have Fable 5 re-released. Let's assume it has certain capabilities. It's a pretty strong model. But Fable 5 has been trained by, let's say, some old school NVIDIA hardware or maybe Trainium AWS hardware. And certainly not Vera Rubin and certainly not Feynman series by NVIDIA, so the new chip generation by NVIDIA, and also AMD has some stuff up its sleeve to actually train better models. So I was asking Fable to imagine we already have the hardware, we have the recursive self-improvement that Anthropic has been pitching around, and also we have the approved algorithms, how we can train, just a few things that are expected to be yielding fruition in 2027 and 28. We assume, or I assumed, we already have that in 2026, July 2026, and how the models Fable 6 and Fable 7 could compare to Fable 5. And one notable change is of course on the autonomous task execution, right? So we came from multiple seconds to minutes to hours to probably with Fable 6 multiple days to Fable 7 probably multiple weeks to maybe even months in 2028 or whenever this model drops. And then of course reinvents a lot of things. In software development, we came from waterfall then to agile, and we have scaled agile, yada yada yada. And probably a new conundrum might be that we have a fully AI native software development lifecycle. And here, just maybe a picture how that could actually look like. Essentially, having 3 or 4 layers, and I'm curious to get your take on this, Joao. First, a knowledge base, which is essentially here to be like the ultimate brain of the entire organization. All the meetings, all the artifacts, all the specifications, all the research, and maybe some discovery that the research and dev team actually did over the years is sitting in this knowledge base. Then we have an intelligence layer in the middle. These are the agentic coding skills that the org manages, and we've talked multiple times about that. It's probably the harness, the rules, the workflows, and maybe some automations in regard to testing. And then below that sits the actual software development lifecycle, requirements, designs, blueprints, the code itself, tests, and then some sort of a feedback loop. And that feeds throughout the system. And behind that, of course, is an array of large language models. Not only one, probably very much multiple of them. And that hopefully is this new phenomenon called the new software development lifecycle in the AI age. What's your take on this, Joao? Is this actually replacing anything you've been doing your whole life?
It's replacing at least big parts of it. Writing code is much long gone. Writing even the architecture, the diagrams and architecture decisions, at least is a good practice to run it some kind of advisory just to get an outside take on it. You can have multiple human architects discussing things, but it gets expensive and it's not as fast as one would hope. And so you can start to offset things. If you orchestrate it well enough, you need very few points where a human actually has to interrupt the flow and add their opinion on them. I think that we're heading to a level where it's much easier for you to have an engineer that does much more than they used to. So not writing the code, they're also doing the architecture, they're also doing product design, they're also doing, the roadmap of the feature roadmap of the product, rather than having the reverse, which is having some kind of non-technical product manager, PM, whatever you want to call it, that didn't know how to code and now tries to do so with the AI, because I think it'd be harder for them to keep a hand on things, especially where things are at the moment. So you can basically promote your employees to have more responsibilities with AI. It is harder, however, to I wouldn't say depromote or unpromote your employees, but to have the top managers do things, because top managers are usually good at handling people and not the tasks themselves. You'd like to have people who are very familiar with the tasks, because those are the ones who can automate them. They know what stuff usually goes wrong, what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. That's the people who are going to automate their job for them, not the people who are just handling those people.
I think it's probably the first time where I'm also a bit questioning where this is a whole heading, right? So now until now we've always had models that are augmenting humans, and still the human that most of, let's say, the actual reviews and the, I would say still not the coding essentially, but it was still mostly in control of the human. So human were delegating and then still somewhat reviewing. I think this new conundrum where Fable 6, Fable 7 type models are really like, I mean, based on my forecast, they're ultimately probably yielding somewhere north of a 98% of agentic coding capabilities. It's essentially near perfect code that's been generated and output, right? So it's like close to perfection. And that's really the question. Then where sits the human? And I think we've talked about that multiple times. We still need humans, of course, for the orchestration, validation, be it in the loop, but also probably ongoingly more is this encoding of expertise into skills, into executables, into some artifacts, probably this encoding and then architecting. I think these two probably roles are still being in place. Maybe one is called a skill encoder or something, and one is called an architect. And then the third one is probably the actual operator that operates the system. It's probably still a heavy technical person that actually executes and orchestrates all these large language models. And then you have a second type of person, an architect, that's like having some sort of a supervision on this, and a third type of component, which is more encoding the knowledge into the agentic language, skills, probably even working on the harnesses, elements like this. I don't know if you have a different take on when this is actually happening and
Yeah,
how.
I do, in a very particular sense, that I think if you search or Google the word context, it's just gonna appear more and more and more, and especially on LinkedIn, like 3 of 4 posts have the word context on them somehow, and it's usually related to AI. The thing about context on a very real use case basis is when you ask an AI, hey, add me a button on the website, the AI will create you, like you said, perfect code for a button or close to perfect. And the button will look very good and be very friendly and easy to use, and it'll work out of the box. However, you ask for a button, it add a button, and the button is right in the middle of the website. You, as the human, know, oh, actually, I want it in the top right corner because I'm planning to add 3 more buttons later for things that are similar. So I want to have them all clustered together. But you didn't say all that. You just asked for a button, and so you got the button. That's what the missing context usually is. It's humans have this knowledge of what you want the website to look like at the end of things, not just after this button, but after 2 months from now or after 6 months from now. And you can change your mind. You will change your mind eventually, and sometimes it's small changes or bigger changes, but you have an idea of how things are going to look like. However, because things are done step by step, you don't want to one shot an entire SaaS model or an entire SaaS platform. You're going to ask a button at a time. And because you're going to ask a button at a time, things may not go the way you want it to. And you can always ask to move the button to the top right corner, bottom left corner, and it's most of the times not really a button that we're talking about. It's an example. But it gives an idea that if you can have a way to write this down, not only what your expected outcome is for now, but your long-term vision, and keep those updated. And you don't have to write the things manually. Most people, I think, should not be writing them manually unless you're really good at writing or you just like it. You can have these kinds of agents just keep the documentation up to date, saying, hey, I'm planning to do this, having this kind of feature. I talked to some clients and they said that they don't really know how to use the buttons, so maybe add some tooltips. And you can have all these rules and all these contexts being built. So when you ask for a new button, yes, the agent will see your request, but they also see this 3, 4, 10 pages of documentation that you've built up over the last couple of weeks or last couple of years, and they'll know what the button is supposed to look like and know what the context of the button is. So when people are talking about context management and the context layer, that's what it is. It's all the information that's hard to say in a single sentence. We mentioned that it's easier to speak to the agent than to actually write things down, because when you speak, you tend to be a bit more verbose. Try to do that. For most people, especially people on Macs, you can just activate the speech to text feature on Macs. Try to say things to your agents instead of typing them down and see what the results look like. They can easily read the 5 to 10 sentences, your little rant or monologue, and do what you want instead of reading 2 sentences with half the typos that you wrote and not get the full context of the full picture of your goals.
Yeah, I think it's certainly why like Whisperflow and these type of voice input startups are also flying currently, because you can give a lot more granular input. And of course, that feeds into the human interface. Like, how do humans actually interact with this software or this new, let's say, software development lifecycle being built on multiple LLMs? And then again, context engineering is super relevant. Harness engineering is super relevant. Loop engineering is super relevant. Orchestration of the whole thing, selecting the right models, and having some sort of a holistic return on AI, because this stuff is not going to be free. That's why on this show, we always talk about the business output in the sense of an AI builder's perspective, but also kind of the financial components, usually within the financial corner that we have, mostly on the stocks, but also certainly if more and more ongoingly into the orgs in regard to return on AI. So that's just the first teaser. For the first time, I think we brought up this new, let's say, phenomenon, SDLC, AI enhanced SDLC, and probably for the next few episodes, we try to give a bit of an update where the whole world of software engineering is heading, especially also because you as an AI builder, if you have built such a, I would say, a system or a platform, you can sell that to organizations and then they can essentially build software by themselves. Or, of course, Anthropic and OpenAI and all the other behemoths, they're probably also moving in that direction. So that's great. Thank you, Joao, for joining. Next time, we're having episode 60, and we're heading probably into new model releases, probably into some other trends. There was a vast array of other topics we had to cut short today. For example, again, new model releases from China, LLM councils, more in detail, and also a bit of an outlook on the stock market, where we are heading. Thank you, Joao, for joining. Enjoy 40 degrees in Lisbon, and we talk next
I'll
week.
try. See
Bye
you next
bye.
week.